Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to the Friends of Hollin Hills 2022 Winter Conversations series. Today, we're going to hear about Hollin Hills and our evolution from subdivision to historic district from two of the people that helped make that happen. Friends of Hollin Hills is a 501c3 organization that works to preserve Hollin Hills' unique architecture and landscape and 31 acres of public parkland as a national historic and local community resource for years to come through action and educational outreach. I'm Barbara Bogue, chair of the Friends of Hollin Hills. Today, I'm honored to introduce architectural preservationist Jere Gibber and Laura Trishman, two of the major drivers, as I noted before, of the Hollin Hills becoming an historic district. Jere helped coordinate the effort. Helped to coordinate the effort. She's a Hollin Hills resident since 1992 and is also executive director of the National Preservation Institute. She helped to coordinate the effort to nominate Hollin Hills as a historic district to the National Register of Historic Places. Laura is the Vermont State Historic Preservation Officer and coordinated work by EHT Traceries to successfully nominate the Hollin Hills Historic District to the National Register of Historic Places. So what we will see, they'll go ahead and they'll explain some of that terminology to start out with, and then also they will just take us through the ins and outs of how this all happened and why and what it means. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items. Please mute your Zoom screen. Also, use the chat function on Zoom to post questions that our speakers will respond to during the Q&A session following the presentation. If you'll notice in your chat screen, you have the possibility of talking to everyone or just one individual. Please go ahead and post it to everyone, your questions, so we don't get repeat questions. We'll answer as many as we can in the time allowed. This presentation, as you were already learned, is being recorded and will be available via the Friends of Hollin Hills website and our YouTube channel. You can find this presentation when it's posted in about a week or so, along with other previous presentations at our website. That's Friends of Hollin Hills, all one word, .org/events.html. We'll let you know through email when this conversation is posted. Finally, we want to thank a few Friends board members that are helping make this happen. Elizabeth Lardner, who organized this session and is managing the Zoom session as well. Rick Hefner, who does our graphics, wonderful as always. And Christine Hooks, who will be adding this to our YouTube channel and managing it. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jere and Laura.
Okay. Going to share my screen. So I hope everybody can now see the slideshow.
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. Laura, please take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time on a Sunday, the first day of spring, to take a tour with us of what a historic district is, what designation means, and why that actually matters. I want to give a special thank you to the Friends of Hollin Hills, Jere, Barbara, Elizabeth, for this opportunity, and also call out J.G. Harrington for his assistance with some photographs. I also want to thank the residents of Hollin Hills and those who've been studying it for so long, like Jere, like your own John Burns. Many, many years ago, you welcomed me to research and evaluate the neighborhood for designation as a historic district when I lived in Washington, D.C. and Virginia and was working at Traceries. I have since transitioned to evaluating historic districts from the other side of the fence as the State Historic Preservation Officer for Vermont. So I must warn you, it's taken me 8 years not to accidentally say Virginia when I mean Vermont in my new job. So I'll apologize ahead of time if you hear me say Vermont today, because I probably mean Virginia. Next slide, please. Hollin Hills was recognized upon its inception as a significant place, a neighborhood that intentionally planned and welcomed owner engagement as it developed. The architect, developer, builder, landscape designer, and the sales team were on site, available, engaged, and interested in their creation and its new tenants. After World War II, most residential neighborhoods in America, and most certainly in the Washington, D.C. region, were planned, with builders typically using the same design over and over again with few modifications, and in many cases, never engaging an architect, let alone a landscape architect to plan the placement of roads, parks, and housing lots. This merchant builder form of development provided returning veterans with modest housing they could afford to buy, and most significantly, a mortgage they could pay off. Drive through parts of Arlington County, for example, to see the merchant builder housing neighborhoods, many of which tell stories of mid-century housing and development for sure, but those stories are very different from Hollin Hills. Robert Davenport and Charles Goodman experimented in Arlington, Fairfax County, Montgomery County on how to marry modern housing that was intentionally not traditional with neighborhood development and natural landscaping. It was small scale, and some would argue it was not all that successful because it seemed out of place to the traditional accepted suburbs, or was located in those suburbs and most definitely stood out. This has consequently made it ripe for substantial alteration or even demolition. But together, these gentlemen achieved harmony in Hollin Hills, the largest of the mid-century Goodman neighborhoods. Next. But why historic preservation? We don't want to live in museums. Families of the 21st century have very different needs of our ancestors. Gone are the ladies' parlors and the men's smoking rooms and the wood panel family rooms with the green shag carpeting. I'm sure most of you remember. The automobile has changed how we interact with each other and the design of our homes. At one point, the car had a larger and more prominent bedroom than the master of the house. And our landscapes were drastically changed to meet the car's opportunities for travel and, of course, always convenience. Point being, things change. So why preserve a place if we want change? There are 5 major points to consider when evaluating if, how, why historic preservation should be a tool for a neighborhood like Hollin Hills. Cultural landscape. Buildings are a direct representation of history and place. As they change over time, they record a piece of each generation's history. Hollin Hills historic buildings create the unique and distinctive sense of place that can be identified only here, characterized by the detailed planning and initial development of a strikingly modern house encased in a planned landscape of nature. If Goodman were dropped into the center of Hollin Hills today, even with the additions and changes that have happened, he would know that it was the Hollin Hills he envisioned and executed for you. Quality. Historic buildings and neighborhoods typically have a higher quality of design, construction, craftsmanship, and materials. Those qualities are intentional, modern, organic, functional, and carefully chosen, in your case, by the architect, developer, builder, and landscape architects. This is not to say that new construction is faulty, but I will say that many new construction materials can be inferior and are often untested. For Hollin Hills, Robert Davenport was instrumental in the purchasing of all the materials. And C.R. Macaulay, as the builder, ensured quality craftsmanship and construction of each building. Again, they were here to watch the construction and ensure quality control. Embodied energy. Preserving an historic building is the ultimate in recycling. It reduces the need for new construction materials, thus avoiding the energy consumption, waste, and pollution from manufacturing and transportation. Preserving an existing building retains the energy expended to create and maintain it. If a building is demolished, the energy investment would be lost and significant new energy demands would be required to replace it. I just recently learned that in Georgia, the Historic Macon Foundation undertook the rehabilitation of 64 properties. They calculated that this kept 6,800 tons of construction and demolition debris out of landfills. They reused 345,000 pounds of metal, 437,000 board feet of lumber, and 567,000 bricks that otherwise would have been thrown out and replaced with new. Another significant factor is sustainability. Historic buildings and neighborhoods have a human scale that was intentional from the conception, in your case, of Hollin Hills. This scale encourages walking and community awareness, provides private spaces and privacy, as well as community connections with parks, recreation, and winding roads. Economic benefits should also be taken into account. Historic buildings represent substantial investments made by previous generations. Rehabilitating a historic building frequently costs less than the construction of a new one. It has been calculated that each dollar spent on a preservation project has a higher percentage devoted to labor than materials as compared to new construction. This supports your local economy, local skilled labor, and keeps money moving in your community. Next. Thank you. So what does a historic district look like? We're all familiar with historic. We know historic when we see it, right? Charleston, Savannah, Old Town Alexandria. These were the first 3 historic districts listed after the creation of the National Historic Preservation Act. They're very significant. They tell a story. Georgetown was actually the 6th local historic district created in the United States and was listed prior to the creation, and that happened in the 1950s, prior to the creation of National Historic Preservation Act, when historic districts were really understood as a tool. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1967. More recently, in 2006, Washington Heights in Washington, D.C. was listed for its development history, varying architecturally significant row houses dating from 1891 to 1950. These are neighborhoods that we recognize as historic districts. But why is that? Because they maybe haven't changed, but they have. Old Town Alexandria tells the story of its development first in 1749 with colonial housing lining planned straight streets around an active harbor. These streets continued to develop in the 19th century, faced the effects of the Civil War, and then in the early part of the 20th century evolved again with new styles and housing forms and commercial development, as well as factory buildings that were added along the formerly active waterfront. This historic district tells the span from 1749 to the early 20th century. That's from our colonial years, George Washington, to the Ford Motor Company industrial facility. There is always more that meets the eye to a historic district, and I encourage you to dive into those stories. Next, please. Lake Ann Village Center is one such neighborhood, constructed between 1963 and 1967. That's during my lifetime. So why is this a historic district? I've driven past it 100 times. It never occurred to me. That's a historic district. It was the first village of a planned community in Reston. It's part of the nation's first zone plan unit community, or a PUC. The Village Center articulates the 7 goals of founder Robert Simmons and illustrates his insistence on an open, pedestrian-friendly, and integrated community that was designed and established in part prior to even the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The design influences are derived from English Garden City movement, from which most residential suburbs of the 19th century and 20th century are modeled. Here, the plan also incorporates the community gathering of European plazas and has townhomes of urban areas like Old Town, Georgetown, and Washington Heights. It learns from our history and brings that all together. It provides retail space, restaurants, an open court, and residential units. Yes, it's in a brutalist influenced architecture, but it has a human scale and also fun medieval elements. For its time, the complex presented a shockingly modern design in an area where single-family colonial revival homes dominated. But this historic district showcases the Newtown movement with social, architectural, and land use development innovations, elements that are internationally recognized today for influencing how we plan developments. Next, please. In your own area, one of the first suburbs developed in Fairfax County was Tuxamont. Originally built by a cooperative founded by young government employees who were drawn to Washington, D.C. for jobs in various New Deal agencies during the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. Cooperative member Robert Davenport, that's your Robert Davenport, developed Tuxamont, creating a site plan of residential streets that followed the natural curving typography of the hills with minimum disruption to the existing trees and undergrowth. This distinguished it from most other contemporary residential neighborhoods that the developer would come in, level the land, lay a checkerboard of streets and uniform identical lots. Tuxamont featured basic and affordable one-story concrete block houses with large windows screened by natural vegetation to provide privacy, and a network of paths that led to a community preschool and center, playing fields, and tennis courts. All three sections of this neighborhood were completed by the 1940s. Tuxamont is where Robert Davenport began to master his development skills. And this is where those skills caught the eye of Charles Goodman. Next, please. Your neighbor, Holmes Run Acres, is a suburban housing development constructed between 1951 and 1958. When developed, it was also dramatically different from other housing developments of the 1950s in Northern Virginia. The modern style dwellings and the design of the neighborhood were a noted departure from the prevalent colonial revival post-war subdivisions. The developer created a neighborhood of affordable houses that took advantage again of the natural landscape, blending those houses into the surroundings. They hired architects Nicholas Satterley and Douglas Labridge to design small, inexpensive housing consisting of standardized features and modules that made the buildings adaptable to fit the needs of the homeowners, something the colonial revival design was not doing. These buildings were influenced by the principles of Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian dwellings. The architects designed the houses in a modern style, featuring open plans, plywood paneling, fixed glass, sliding windows. The dwellings were staggered along heavily wooded lots to give maximum privacy and embedded new modernism during a time when the ranch, house, and the colonial revival style were much more popular in suburban communities nearby. Next. But the largest of these modern housing developments was Hollin Hills, taking what worked in Holmes Run Acres, Reston, Montgomery County, Tuxamont, even those colonial revival neighborhoods, to create what worked with those to create a neighborhood of nearly 500 homes. Although those other neighborhoods were respecting the land and providing a modern design, it's here in Hollin Hills that the concepts went further. Hollin Hills drew national and international attention as the first planned subdivision to combine novel land planning, modern house and landscape designs, and an innovative merchandising plan that required the lots and the house models to be sold separately. Houses in Hollin Hills were situated on lots in order to articulate the site's existing slopes and woods, giving Goodman the opportunity to design 8 modern house types with variations in square footage and interior amenities, comprising 15 different combinations. He created modern designs with standardized modular units with open interiors and trimless wood window walls, non-traditional house profiles, and prefabricated components. Hollin Hills reflected Goodman's conviction that the traditional house forms like the colonial revival and the ranch had no place in 20th century development. I'd spent 20 years surveying, documenting, and nominating those ranch houses and colonial revival neighborhoods, mostly in Arlington County, when in the early 2000s, your own Jere Gibber and preservation consultant Elizabeth Lample reached out to Traceries, where I was working. Joey Lample was working with Montgomery County planning staff to record the small neighborhood developments of Goodman housing, and through her research found the gem that is Hollin Hills. This was my first real introduction to modern housing, to modern neighborhood development, and I was immediately hooked. Next, please.
Oop, sorry.
But what is a historic district? It's a story, one that matters. It is not a beauty contest, as the Vermont State architectural historian always reminds me. It's not always where George Washington slept. It need not be a unique story. It can be from our lifetimes. It requires in-depth research and survey. It can be subjective, but it can always be justified by the tools historic preservationists use. There are varying levels of historic districts. There's state, local, national. The most common is the National Register of Historic Places, created in 1966 as part of the National Historic Preservation Act. It's overseen by the National Park Service, which has created bulletins, guidelines, historic context studies on how to survey, document, research, and justify the significance of those stories. The facts of why this place matters and should be shared and recognized. These tools ensure there is consistency, benchmarks, and standards for how to evaluate and nominate. Many states, like Virginia, have a state register, which has adapted the same guidelines and evaluation criteria as the National Register. Locally, in Fairfax County, there's an inventory of historic sites, which is quite simply a catalog of historically significant places in the county. There are about 350 plus sites on this inventory. They range from George Washington's Mount Vernon, include bridges, churches, and neighborhoods like Holmes Run Acres and Hollin Hills. The Fairfax County Inventory, the Virginia Landmarks Register, the National Register are honorific lists telling a story of people, events, places, and why those matter, what we can learn from them. So why do it? It's just a list. But these lists define a sense of place, history, and most assuredly play a role in tourism and scholarship. These lists are also a tool for evaluating impacts to our history. Federal agencies are charged with examining how new projects or alterations to existing projects affect, alter, or even destroy our history, landscape, places. And if there are alternatives that can create a win-win, Next, please. So how does the process start? It actually begins with boots on the ground. Neighborhoods are visited. Communities are engaged. I always started National Register nomination and survey efforts with a community meeting, hearing everyone's stories about how their building was constructed, who lived there, when they bought it, how they've changed it. Each building is recorded using a standardized form noting the construction and design materials, roof shape, height, window types, chimneys, date of construction, alterations. A site plan is prepared with a rough footprint of the buildings, recording the outbuildings, driveway, road, natural resources. Photographs are taken from the right-of-way. For Hollin Hills, because there were 15 unit designs, original Goodman variations, and subsequent alterations, we were lucky to have the assistance of residents. I give a good shout out to Jere for this, and a builder whose father was part of the original construction team who drove by each one of the houses to figure out what those unit types were as best as we could from the street front. The research for Hollin Hills was not difficult because Goodman, Davenport, and the wonderful residents of Hollin Hills have kept excellent records. I really need to give you a shout out. Your website is fabulous and a great, fun resource. And thankfully, Goodman's papers are archived at the Library of Congress. We were able to explore those and also use Joey Lample's in-depth research that resulted in a historic context report on Goodman, focusing, of course, on his work in Montgomery County, but how that influenced what he was doing in Hollin Hills. Gaining traction about the time we were doing this was the National Park Service multiple property document. This is a historic context study called Historic Residential Suburbs in the United States, 1830 to 1960. This document outlines the history of suburban development, the architectural styles, the developers, the influences, how it was affected by the railroad, how it was affected by commercial development, how it was affected by the automobile. It establishes timelines for which planned neighborhoods developed. So there is some comparison and understanding of those influences. Hollin Hills is an example of a post-World War II and early freeway suburb. Next, please. So I keep mentioning a place needs to tell the story. Every place has a story, of course. That is why nomination of a building or a place is just not simply the story, but why that story matters. Does it reflect the significant event or a place? Does it represent an important person? Illustrate architectural design of a distinct period or architect, or workmanship, craftsmanship? Or does it have archaeological secrets of the past yet to be explored? It doesn't need to have all of these. It only needs to have one. To place a building or a location into context, we identify a period of significance. This is when those things happened. For Hollin Hills, it's when the property was first purchased through to the construction of the last building and the closing of Davenport's real estate offices. The areas of significance summarize the history of a building or a place and what it is telling. Is it architecture, industry, education, community planning, social history, medicine, military? Then comes the most important step, and I think actually the most fun step, and this is evaluation of integrity. Can the physical tell the story of the significance from that time period, from those areas of history? Would George Washington recognize Mount Vernon or even Old Town? Would Charles Goodman know Hollin Hills? Would Robert Davenport field home in Tuxamont? Would Robert E. Lee find his way to Manassas Battlefield? Or would he know Arlington House? Again, we do not need to create museums, places stuck in time. That is not the point. I believe the greatest part of the history for residential neighborhoods, residential historic districts in particular, is that change. And the elements of integrity allow for a way to measure the change. For a historic district, the neighborhood as a whole is evaluated for its integrity. Then each building is evaluated as contributing or non-contributing to the historic district. The elements of integrity are design, workmanship, material, setting, location, feeling, and association. You do not need to have all of them. You need to identify which ones are most important. Next, please. The survey of Hollin Hills for listing in the National Register identified 460 houses, measuring each against the original unit design or variation within a period of significance from 1946 to 1971, reflecting the areas of significance and retaining individual integrity. 13 primary dwellings were listed as non-contributing. The rest of the non-contributing are outbuildings, sculpture, garages. 9 of those 13 are altered so significantly on the facades that the original design could not be discerned. 4 were constructed outside the period of significance. These are not Goodman designs. They were not under the direction of Davenport. Many, most, maybe all of the houses in Hollin Hills have changed since the first owners opened the front doors and moved in. Again, change is okay. History is change, as long as it's thoughtful and respectful. And for those lots not yet developed by 1971 in Hollin Hills, new modern buildings were added. These respected the mission of the neighborhood of Goodman, the landscape designer Kylie, your developer Davenport, as they had envisioned it. They're still outside the period of significance. They do not reflect the areas of significance. It doesn't mean that they're bad designs or that they're not attractive or don't add to the history. They just do not add to the history of Goodman Davenport. Next, please. Integrity of a historic district matters, and change, while sometimes good and okay, can go too far for us historic preservationists. For example, Levitt Town on Long Island in New York was created by Abram Levitt and his son, William and Alfred. Levitt Town was the first planned community in the United States, the very first, created between 1947 and 1959, specifically for returning World War II veterans. This was the first fully mass-produced neighborhood and is widely regarded as the archetype for post-war suburbs in the United States. William Levitt is considered the father of modern suburbia. He moved his father Abraham's company to design and construct small one-story houses with unfinished expansion attic space. The houses were rapidly constructed, rented to GIs and their families. The cost-effective, speedy construction, which actually was mimicked in Hollin Hills years later, used pre-cut lumber and nails from the company's own factory and were set on precast concrete slabs. This actually required a change in building codes. The company cut out the middleman for design, planning, landscape, construction, and materials, very much like Goodman and Davenport did. They completed 2,000 houses, selling each for $8,000. The houses included fully stocked modern appliances and a television. Without design review board or regulations other than unfortunate restrictive covenants, those houses exploded over the years with massive additions, grew to encapsulate neighboring houses and lots, or were demolished for larger buildings that presented a completely different architectural appearance. Despite its history and far-reaching influences of suburban development nationwide, Levittown no longer has integrity of architecture. It's ineligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. William Levitt would have no idea this was the Levittown that he designed if he drove through it. Next, please. The National Register nomination is, I admit, a daunting document, but it describes a place, tells why it matters, and it compares it to similar places. Your nomination is over 115 pages long. It includes a very detailed inventory of contributing, non-contributing status as it was seen when the nomination was prepared. It outlines the development history, justifies the significance. It talks about the architectural and landscape designs for which it is eligible under criterion C. It talks about the community planning for which it is recognized under criterion A, and explains why under criteria consideration G, which is less than 50 years, it's relevant neighborhood. There was extensive research, as I mentioned. There's 3 pages of bibliography and a rather in-depth comparison statement of all Goodman's developments in the DC metro area. Again, this was not the first recognition of your neighborhood. Hollin Hills was listed in Fairfax County Inventory of Historic Sites in 1972, the Virginia Landmarks Register in 2013, and months later on the National Register of Historic Places. Again, these first 3 are honorific, creating awareness, sharing the history, documenting, and celebrating. The Historic Overlay District that you just recently got is a means of protecting. This designation, I know, just happened, and many of you have a lot of questions related to what that means. But there will be future presentations that will dig into that for you. Next, please. I just really quickly wanted to go over some of the points in the significance statement for the Hollin Hills in the National Register. Many of these you've heard me saying. It's a significant work of a renowned modernist architecture. It recognized the significance of architectural design at a state level. It is recognized for its community planning and development efforts at a national level. It reflected Robert Davenport's financing and innovative Goodman modern designs with open plans, traditional, non-traditional modern appearances, and prefabricated components. Next, please. It exemplifies the merchant builder housing, Davenport acting as the developer builder and Goodman serving as the architect and planner. It recognizes the specific siting and planning, illustrating the success of designing with the land rather than altering it. It recognized the modern design with your trimless window walls, economical construction practices with prefabrication and assembly taking place right on site. Next, please. Hollin Hills and other Goodman and Davenport neighborhoods are not the only mid-century historic districts in the United States. There are at least 20 recognized, the first being in 1998. Remember, there's always more that meets the eye, and it's not a beauty contest. Watergate's listed as a planned unit development, a PUC, designed to be a city within a city, and was the first mixed-use development in the District of Columbia. It's an odd-looking complex for sure. And of course, it is fully recognized for other things like a break-in in 1972. But I can guarantee this property would be listed on the National Register of Historic Places today, even if the break-in had never happened. I encourage you to read these nominations, explore these neighborhoods, include these places in your holiday plans to see them firsthand. Next, please. And of course, there are many more neighborhoods, yes, yet to be listed as historic districts, yet to be fully documented, yet to be recognized as significant mid-century neighborhoods. But without the tools of inventory of historic sites, landmark designations, and the National Register, these places might never ever truly be appreciated, known, or preserved. Next, please. Again, so why nominate? It's an honorific recognition. There's an awareness of the architectural design and an appreciation of history and pride of place. You boast that you live in a historic district, a place that tells a story and you can appreciate it and learn from it. You didn't accidentally move into Hollin Hills because there was a house available. Hollin Hills welcomed you by its innovative modern housing, novel land plan with parks and winding roads. You live here for a reason. So protecting it is important. As I mentioned earlier, National Register designation does pose some protection from federal involvement. When there is a federal agency funding a project, what is called Section 106 kicks in, and they have to evaluate how that project affects the historic neighborhood. They will know already, that is Hollin Hills. We do not want to be putting any roadways, new construction, anything through there. Also in Virginia, you have funding at a residential level, homeowner level, Virginia tax credits. I encourage you to look into these programs with the state. Next, please. One of the greatest tools for preserving a sense of place are the Secretary of Interior's standards and guidelines addressing the treatment of historic properties. Honestly, this document ensures we are not creating museums, but allowing buildings to live, change, and evolve. There are 4 tenets to the standards: preservation, which is keeping it as it was; restoration, fix it like it was; rehabilitation, repair it, alter it, add to it while protecting the character defining features; and reconstruction, which is replacing it like it was, rebuilding it. Mount Vernon is preserved. The Pentagon after 9/11 was restored. Governor's Palace at Williamsburg was reconstructed. Most projects involving historic buildings and all historic districts follow the principles of rehabilitation. An important factor in the level of architectural integrity maintained in Hollin Hills has been the design review, which was instituted by Davenport and Goodman to enforce covenants requiring alteration to, in their words, maintain harmony and conformity with the existing designs. This is one of the older creations of design review guidelines in our country, ensuring that modern houses, designed landscapes, and irregular lots are for the most part maintained as originally envisioned. Next, please. Goodman and Davenport saw the merchant builder housing dominating the landscape of America, those Levitt town copies with modest, small, and confining houses and lots. To start development, the undulated landscape was leveled, trees were cut, creating a blank canvas from which to start a neighborhood. Instead, the lots of Hollin Hills invite expansion, and the architect planned for it. He encouraged it. The original marketing plan spoke of how they would design a plan for your chosen lot, for your family, for your future. You purchased a lot first, then you worked with Goodman and Davenport and a landscape designer to find the right house for you. The architect was fully aware of change and the organic, creating unit designs that allowed for expansion, enabling additions that 50 years later could respect the original design, setting, materials, workmanship to contribute to the original design and overall neighborhood. Next, please. Thoughtful planning architectural design and siting of buildings on lots enabled additions to ensure the modest homes of Hollin Hills can still serve 21st century tenants. What Goodman didn't encourage was design, as the design review guidelines anticipated, was alterations. Two examples from Rock Creek Woods and Hammond Wood in Montgomery County, these buildings have been so altered, they no longer reflect the original design. Next, please. Because of the size of the lots, the suburban location, and honestly, admittedly, the modest size of the houses, modern housing like that in Hollin Hills, Homes Run Acres, Tuxamont, and even the historic neighborhoods of Arlington and Fairfax counties with rows and rows of colonial revival houses are ripe for development. This 1952 house was just recently replaced by this very large house. Next, please. Same thing happened just down the street. This 1951 house in Homes Run Acres was demolished. And 2 years later, a very large house was put in its place. Next, please. Loss of integrity and demolition affects a historic district's overall character forever. Corner lots in Homes Run Acre are definitely ripe for development. Busy streets that lead you to commercial areas are also ripe for development. I took a small portion of Homes Run Acre and I marked all of the buildings that have changed since the original designation. Those are marked with those red stars. It slowly is eating away at the historic district to where the boundaries may be changed or the whole historic district no longer reflecting for which the topic for which it was important. Next, please. Because there are mechanisms for delisting or removing a building or a place from the National Register. It's not easy to do. In fact, the last state to ever do it was Vermont. Grounds for removing from the National Register basically are inaccurate documentation. There was an error in the evaluation. There was a procedural error in the nomination, the review. Additional information has been found because we are regularly updating and looking at neighborhoods. Demolition and alteration matter as we go back and continue to research. Demolition, the loss of integrity, new information, errors in the original application. These are all mechanisms for delisting a property. It is not often done. There are about 50 plus delistings nationally each year. I just really want to stress to you that what you have is special, significant. It tells a fabulous story, unlike other neighborhoods, even those established by Goodman and Davenport. It is a very special place. It is not stuck in time. It was designed to continue to evolve and meet your needs. And that could be done very sensitively while still celebrating, as Davenport even publicized himself, American architecture at its best. Next, please. I want to thank you for appreciating history and being stewards of that architecture. Again, you live here for a reason. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate that presentation. Are there any questions? And again, we would ask you to do it on the side chat, but since we seem not to have any there now, perhaps just directly suggestions or comments, please raise your hand or put it in the side chat. So Well, I guess that's, oh, here we go. Where was the office that has the address of 7400? Was on the last slide. Do either of you know that?
I do not.
I have heard that that was by the swimming pool. Is that where the swimming pool now stands? Is that correct? That the
Yes.
office was there and that's where
Yes.
the workshop was there as well?
That's exactly right. Yes.
Sure.
He had kind of like a mobile home, which was his typical. Davenport would move into any neighborhood that he was developing and he would use that as his office.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, we might have to do some more research on the 7,400 number, but that's beyond today.
Well, weren't all the numbers redone in Fairfax
Yes.
County? So it's probably because our house has a different address on the plans.
Yes, that's exactly right. Which makes it fun when you're trying to figure out property owner's name on the drawings and then the house with a different street address as they change.
So Jerry, I would like to ask about your involvement and about how you brought the community along, because I think that's an interesting piece. I mean, it's fascinating to get the whole historical perspective of the value and importance. But I'm just wondering about the mechanics from your point of view.
Well, I think that, you know, for many years, and John Burns would have that information too. We, of course, were very interested in getting Hollin Hills on the National Register of Historic Places, but it wasn't until Joey Lample, who Laura mentioned, invited Pam Koger Jessup and myself up to a meeting in Montgomery County, because they were just starting their project on Goodman. And so she invited us up there, and that sort of gave us the impetus to sort of get back into the swing of things and thinking about, you know, how we could go about. And it still took us many years after that, but it was Joey Lample's invitation was really the impetus for getting us going again.
And what kind of involvement did it require from just Hollin Hills residents?
Well, it was a huge, huge community effort. I mean, there were meetings. We had, oh my goodness, we had so many people helping do photographs and run around the neighborhood. And I mean, there must have been 50 or 75 people that were involved in the actual work that were volunteers. And that was, you know, above and beyond all the work that, you know, EHT Traceries did with Laura working that we hired. We hired EHT Traceries to make sure we did it the right way. I mean, we were using black and white film cameras to document everything, because the Virginia Department of Historic Resources still required us to use film back then. I mean, we did the inventories. It took years and so many people, and it was really a community effort.
Terrific.
I would add to that, Barbara, that out of the 100 historic districts and nominations that I've done in my short career.
That sounds long, but.
Hollin Hills is still the #1 neighborhood to jump in and be a part of this. The number of volunteers was really amazing and just really shows that it is such a special place in everyone's heart, that you live there for a reason.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple other questions. One is there a connection with Palm Springs, California in the 1950, 1960 communities? So was there any interlinking, I guess we're being asked, between the various communities that were being developed?
I think a lot of tenants from all of them. They were, you know, looking to the past, looking to how things were working and being developed elsewhere. Just as Davenport tried things out in Tuxamont and Goodman tried in Montgomery County. All these architects were communicating together. And there was also a good number of publications out. So they were very fully aware of what was working, what was not, what was being promoted in the design, even the materials.
Okay, so there's just a lot of synergy among all of
Yes,
the
absolutely.
designers and architects. Okay, we have another question. What are the limitations of an alteration to maintain a conforming status for homes in Hollin Hills? So I think you were talking about there's certain things that just have to be there. So maybe you could talk about this in a general way as what that means.
In general, from the street view, you need to maintain the original massing and form, the roof height. If it were a one-story building and then there was an alteration that you can see that changes it to 2 stories, that would be non-contributing. So you need to keep the roof line. You don't necessarily in a historic district need to keep the windows, but the window configuration needs to be the same. In neighborhoods like yours in particular, it doesn't mean that the doors have to stay the same. But if all the buildings had doors of a certain type, like behind you, I can see the wood door with glass. If they were all that way, you wanted to ensure that the vast majority of the houses had that. So you need to keep the character defining features that make it feel like a mid-century house from 1946 to 1971. And also because you have such a long time span in your historic district development, you have materials changing. You have materials that are being tested, having materials that are working and are not working. So the design itself is even evolving. The first of the houses may have used a certain material that the houses at the later end are not using. So that's where the individual evaluation of a house is looked at. Some of them had things like carports, some of them did not. Some of them have garages, some of them do not. This helps in a historic district because it means that you might be able to sensitively add a carport or enclose a carport.
But you're saying that one of the main considerations is the view from the street?
Most definitely, and you certainly do not want to see large additions from the street. I had conversations with the National Park Service for Arlington County in particular, where large additions would come to the back of a house and you could see it peeking over and they would say it's non-contributing. So additions and alterations are okay. They need to respect what's there, but you also want to make sure that they don't copy what's there so that anybody going by can be like, oh, I think that's an addition. That must be an alteration.
I think that when we've been looking at the historic overlay district and the difference between the National Register and the historic overlay district, they did add more houses that were non-contributing because there have been so many changes since the National Register, but not a lot, very few actually. So we did pretty well on adding only a few. And I think that Laura was right. That's really how Fairfax County's planners looked at it. They looked at it much as she described, what you can see from the street, that kind of thing. That's a lot of the ones that were the new non-contributing that were added. Those were really the reasons, I think.
So we have one piece of information coming in from Naomi Medvin, who was an original resident. She said there's a farmhouse in Fort Hunt Road that served as an office.
Mm-hmm.
About the location of the tennis courts 3 and 4, they thought of making it into a clubhouse, but there was not enough support. Sadly, I have to say. So it was demolished. Yeah. So we have another question. Can you bring a non-contributing house back into contributing status?
That's a difficult question because it depends on how much alteration occurred to make the non-contributing. So if you put a big addition on the side of a building and you've taken off its original side, you're basically reconstructing. If you are changing a roof line, you could be reconstructing it. It's evaluated on an individual basis, and it depends. I hate that. It depends on how much alteration was done and how well the rehabilitation to return it back was undertaken, so that you don't end up with too much reconstruction.
Is there a place that someone could get, I'm guessing this, this questioner has something specific in mind. Is there some place that they could go to get advice on a particular house? Is there an advisory group, or is there someone you could seek out?
I would start with Jere, sorry, and the standards for rehabilitation, kind of give you some input as to where you're moving from rehabbing to reconstructing versus restoring. And then now that you've got the overlay district, Fairfax County is your resource.
So Ryan is following up with, is there a resource to find the original plans for a specific house?
Most of the original plans can be found at the Library of Congress in Goodman's papers.
And they're very friendly there when you call up. You just ask for the Goodman archives and tell them what you want. They go above and beyond helping out. So, are there any other questions? Well, again, thank you very much, both of you, and the preparation on this. This talk will be up on the web, as I said, within probably a couple of weeks. And as soon as it is, we will be sending it out to the list of our SVPs and also to other places so they can see what we've seen today. So thanks a lot, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much.